welcome to the very first episode of Have I Got Views For You, where we're going to be looking at how opinion has changed over the week and what kind of opinion pieces we've seen written. So joining me today is Angela Haggerty from Common Space, who's going to be chatting a little bit about the opinion pieces that have popped up there. And obviously one of the big things in the news over the last week has been the refugee crisis. So what's kind of been the take on that?
Yeah, it's been a huge story it's amazing to think it was only a week ago that this started to really take off. It feels like it's been longer than that, so much has happened. But naturally we had quite a few pieces in from our columnists and contributors on that. One of the first ones was from James McInerney. He's one of our regular weekly writers, and he did a piece titled "When a Photograph Means More Than All the Words We Can Write," and of course this is in reference to the picture of little Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old boy that died as his family were trying to flee war. So James was writing about the birth of his own son Kieran, and how after quite a difficult pregnancy for his wife, Kieran took ill just after he was born, and he's talking about how that, you know, it kind of really hit home to him how important family and everything was, and that came into his head when the news about Alan Kurdi came out. And it was quite an emotional piece. All the pieces that we got from columnists on this really could really get how much this was affecting people. So he wrote, "Alan Kurdi was a little older than my child, his clothes a little bigger, his skin and hair a little darker, but in every way that really matters, this boy was no different from the son who means the world to me." And he goes on to say, "I struggle to understand how a continent whose collective identity was forged in the fire of almost unfathomable suffering could have failed so many for so long. I struggle to understand how any human heart can be so hardened by hatred that it becomes possible to be indifferent to the suffering of millions. I struggle to understand how a Prime Minister can claim to have done enough for refugees and then bear to look at his own reflection." It's quite strong words. And then it kind of takes us into the piece from Sean Milne titled "We Can't Allow Alan Kurdi's Death to Become Nothing More Than the Next Cecil the Lion." And Sean's quite angry in this piece, and then people that know Sean's writing know he's quite a funny writer and he's quite witty, but no, Sean was really angry in this article. And this is about the response from some of the other people about this that's been a bit less than compassionate. And he says, "If someone is drowning in the sea and I can help them, I give not one fuck about the colour of their skin or where they come from. A human being needs help. We are better than this indifference. We are better than just letting this fade into the news cycle to be replaced by the next outrage. Let us not allow Alan Kurdi's death to become nothing more than the next Cecil the Lion." So quite strong stuff from Sean this week. We can do more. We can contribute to saving people's lives. In what sort of a world would that not take precedence over everything else? And just as a side note, I think Sean only said fuck 4 or 5 times in this article this week.
That's
so
pretty good for him, yeah.
Back.
It could be a record. But I mean, of course, this ties into the kind of changing tide of opinion. I mean, if you look back to The Sun, a few weeks ago was running its usual campaigns about, you know, we can't take any more and everything else. And then as soon as the death of Ireland happened, suddenly they've got a campaign called For Ireland, which kind of rubs me up the wrong way quite a bit. But it's definitely shown that photograph has changed a lot. But why did it come to that before we actually saw that change?
It shows the power of something like photojournalism, though. I mean, that is an amazing thing. Some of the most iconic photographs have created this massive change of opinion in the public sphere, because there's just something about, I mean, there's a lot of harrowing photographs out there about this crisis, about many crises, but now and again there's just one that comes along that seems to encapsulate everything in that one image, and it really gets to people, and that photograph of Ireland done that. And it kind of takes us to the next piece by Kath Sullivan, how the refugee crisis underlines the power of language. And that's what she talks about. She talks about the kinds of words that we've used that have sort of dehumanised refugees over the course, and it's made people feel less compassionate, and then all of a sudden you have this photograph that comes along and it makes everyone start to reconsider. So she was thinking about the words like migrant and swarm. A lot of people got annoyed that the BBC kept calling it a migrant crisis. It's not just the BBC, granted, but it was referred to that at first rather than refugee crisis, and David Cameron, I think, was the one that used the word swarm, wasn't he? So she's keen to point out the difference in that piece, that refugees and migrants are different. But then she also goes on to say, many people in Scotland will go to France or Germany or another country for work, financial reward and culture. It's not a one-way process, and we tend to regard this as okay when it's this way. When we go abroad to live, we tend to use the term expats, which has none of the prejudice or negative connotations, and we expect to have our normal rights and material conditions. We even expect the culture to adapt around us and our needs. We are still powerful.
And there was a poll a little while ago that showed that we we're much less tolerant to people coming to the UK to find jobs, whereas we expected that we could go to other places to find jobs. It's kind of a weird dissonance between what we expect of others and what we consider ourselves to be, which might be a hang-up left over from the empire of, well, we can go where we want, we can go do our thing, it's fine. But no, not here. You know, Britain for the British.
Yeah.
First and foremost.
The great thing as well about the way this has changed over the last week is seeing the level of debate on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, and everybody's remarked that people that are quite political are seeing people that are not political at all on their timelines coming up, and they're all talking about this. They've all got opinions on it. So it's kind of made everyone examine their own views a little bit more and think about the language that they're using and the way that they think about other people, which I think can only ever be a good thing when we're questioning ourselves.
Absolutely.
And then the last piece we had on it was from Richard McGinley, How to Solve the Refugee Crisis, which is a very promising headline, I must say. But Richard was looking at the political side of this. He was looking at the way that we're so keen to help some people and a lot less keen to help others. And Richard does this in his usual way on Common Space. He brings his own kind of dollop of dry humour to things. So he says, as David Cameron hesitates to help out, perhaps we should use another word to describe these poor souls who have decided that it is much safer rather to pack their families into marine vessels of varying reliability than to stay where they are. As referring to those poor souls as refugees or migrants cuts no ice with our Prime Minister, maybe we should call them bankers. Cameron would swim out there with a rope between his teeth and haul the boats back to Portsmouth himself. And he concludes, if there's one thing he loves more than bankers, it's being Prime Minister. If he doesn't start acting like one, we can always find someone who will.
Excellent. And definitely the refugee crisis has caused a lot of debate, and it's good to see people really kind of discussing it and kind of engaging with it. Yeah. It's not something that we should be ignoring, and it's good that the press is engaging with that question.
And then that kind of takes us on to the next topic that was a bit prominent on Common Space this week, and that was drones. And this was kind of connected to Ireland's death, because I think, as you mentioned, the Sun's coverage about for Ireland, did they not sort of do a call for bombs? Did they not want us to bomb Syria for Ireland?
It wasn't like, for Ireland we should bomb Syria, and then photos come up of Ireland's home where he had to flee, which is why he drowned, and it's been bombed already. It's kind of...
it was a bit odd.
It is a bit odd.
But then, of course, we had the announcement that 2 British citizens were killed in drone strikes, which seemed almost like it was the government's way of responding to that rise in public desire for some sort of an action. But Common Space readers, I think, on the whole, have been very concerned about this. Bill Ramsey, the SNP C&D chair, wrote a piece, Why the UK's Use of Drones is Something You Need to Know About. And he says drones, particularly weaponised drones, have many uses, apparently now including the ability to fly around parliamentary oversight in the UK. The ability to use weaponised drones to wage war without declaring war, and the de facto introduction of the death sentence into the body of British jurisprudence are only 2 of a number of reasons why a campaign to ban weaponised drones should be seriously considered. But then he does also go on to say that the practicalities around the use of drones must be properly considered if you're going to convince anyone either way. He says the media will try to paint anti-drone campaigners as pacifists, so you have to think about how you frame that debate. It's not necessarily that you're saying that no kind of a military response can be on the table, but you're looking specifically at the use of drones and the ethics around that sort of stuff, and kind of trying to open up a bit more debate that way. He also mentions the possibility of harmful psychological effects. And then he goes for Cameron in his conclusion. He says Cameron's use of weaponised drone technology to phase down parliamentary sovereignty is in truth a potential constitutional crisis. It is an act by our Prime Minister as immoral as it is audacious. And of course that's in reference to the fact that this wasn't passed through Parliament, these actions. Now David Cameron says he did have a legally sound case for doing it, but this is all being argued out by legal types and human rights campaigners, and there's a lot of people very, very sceptical as to how this all came around, including journalist Yvonne Ridley, who wrote a piece called Why Scottish Voters Shouldn't Trust Westminster. Now she actually starts off with the vow in this piece, where she's talking about we're coming up to the year's anniversary, or we might even be there now.
We're very close. I think next week it will be, but yeah.
Yeah. And she's looking at whether Westminster is keeping its promises and whether we can trust Westminster to keep its promises. And she's not convinced with the vow, and she goes on to say that it's happening again, this time with the drone bombings in Syria. And she says, don't get me wrong, I, like many others, will not be shedding a tear for the elimination of 2 men, one Scottish, who signed up to go and fight with the terror group Daesh, which is the name some people use for Islamic State. She says, however, if the British government is going to embark on what can only be described as extrajudicial killings, then the British voters need to know, and their MPs, all of them, need to be consulted. She goes on to say, it's little wonder that the SNP's 56 MPs are outraged, and Angus Robertson has in fact called for a review by the Intelligence and Security Committee. And she says, little wonder then, after the success of the no vote a year ago, the polls are now telling a different story in favour of an independent Scotland. As long as Cameron continues to disregard the SNP 56 in Westminster, voters will wake up to the fact they have little or no voice in the London Parliament. And of course that's in reference to the second poll that's been out in a week. That has shown that the support for independence is, I think it was at 53% this week when you excluded
53% with undecideds excluded.
And it was 55% the week before.
Yeah, the week before there was a 9-point difference between yes and no. So it's really kind of went up. And particularly the poll showed that support for independence tends to be between 16 to 25, whereas as high as between 70 and 80%, I think it was. I mean, it's definitely a lot of people who are coming into politics for the first time and presumably maybe don't have any baggage from previous governments and everything, and just look at the situation going, this doesn't quite add up as it is. So, but it is very interesting to see that that's still continuing alongside everything else that's happening. Coming up to 1 year on IndieRef, and this is the support for independence is going higher, which then takes us on nicely to the next piece. Actually, this is from James McInerney, and this is in reference to some interviews that Jim Sellers, former SNP MP, has been doing this week. He's got a book coming out, and he's been doing a lot of interviews about IndieRef and what went wrong, and how IndieRef 2 should be conducted and those kinds of things. Common Space, we spoke to Jim as well and ran a few pieces. And James agrees with Jim Sellers on a lot of the things he says. Jim Sellers' view was that the campaign for independence was too closely connected to the SNP, that it should have been a bit more separate. The SNP should have been a party involved with it, but not necessarily the people to be leading it. So he agrees. He says he thinks that Jim Sellers was right to argue that the Yes campaign was too closely tied to the SNP, and that the White Paper in particular was a huge mistake. He thinks that pro-Yes plurality is key, not just to winning an eventual Yes vote, but to building a country worth voting yes for. Definitely. And definitely, if we're talking, because Jim Sellers is always arguing about the concept of a separate currency, if we're coming round to the concept of another referendum, which if we'd had probably more plurality, that vision could have been a little bit better explored, because the Greens were very vocal about an independent currency was what was required, and I'm sure Commonweal took a position as well relating to having your own central bank and how that would be overall better because we'd have control over these things, but instead we were kind of all just, it's the currency union or nothing. And certainly during the campaign itself there was discussions, I have to say, a currency union could be a stopgap until we realise what we actually do need down the line. But
so it's been a great point of debate, those interviews coming out this week, and it has really got people talking. But then to go on to something completely different, we had a piece from Gary Elliott, who said the best way to support Gaelic is to learn it, and here's how to do it. And I'm glad I said it right. I said Gaelic because that's correct, isn't it? Scots Gaelic and Irish Gaelic. Because I've been calling it Gaelic all week, and I was thinking I better not do that because I'm going to upset people. You're not the only one. But this came following a bit of a stushy on Twitter about Gaelic. We love a stushy on Twitter, don't we? And Gary was actually writing a different column that week, and he completely scrapped that to get involved in this because he feels quite passionate about the language. So this all started on Wings Over Scotland. A stushy starting on Wings Over Scotland.
Oh, funny that, yeah.
Oh. And it happened after Jackson Carlaw, the deputy Scottish Tory leader, said that putting Gaelic on road signs cost millions upon millions of pounds to do. So naturally, Wings doing the Wings thing, he took that claim and he ripped it apart, as he does brilliantly. However, in familiar Wings style, trying to make everybody happy, he titled the piece "The Lesser of Two Stupids," and opened with the line, "Let's start off by losing some more friends." So, with a few little insults thrown in about the Gaelic language, as I'm sure some people would have said, the basic argument was that Gaelic is obsolete and that the time and effort that's required to learn it could be put to better uses. Cue the inevitable hoo-ha on Twitter, with people making good points about what language means to them and how important it is to their culture, and I was getting involved in that, and Bella Caledonia was jumping in, and we were all kind of taking punches at each other. But Gary, bless him, didn't want to get involved in the bickering, and he says, instead of angry rebuttal, I decided that I would write something far more positive. In short, I'd like to say this: if you really want to do something positive to help Gaelic, learn the language. I write this as somebody who around 11 years ago had no Gaelic whatsoever, but who has learned it from scratch to a reasonable degree of fluency. Every single person who learns Gaelic is making a real difference, because Gaelic is an ancient language of Scotland that is in danger of extinction. And he offers some great tips and resources in the piece as well for anyone that's interested in learning Gaelic. And he concludes, so go on, let's make a real difference by learning the language in our thousands. And for all those who have the language either as a mother tongue or because we've learned it, let's use it loudly, proudly and often. And if anybody would like to see those resources, visit commonspace.scot, go into the opinion section, you'll find Gary's piece, and he's got loads of links to different things that you can look at.
Great.
Did you notice the Stushy on Twitter?
Oh yeah, I was following it. I did Gaelic for a while at uni, so I have a wee bit of Gaelic, but it's a very confusing language. I can pretty much just all I really remember is how to like say, you know, like Fiskin ma Camarahau, or is it Hagama Tapaloy, Achami Bacon Ski. So I got bits.
I'm impressed. I think I had Feskin ma. I think
that's it.
Where my
just
Gaelic
like
finishes. I would love to learn Gaelic though. Fascinated by
it's a really beautiful language, and it has such a way with words. Maybe if you look at whiskey, obviously in Ushkabea, which translates as the water of life. There's a real poetry in the language, which is why I do think it's important to continue seeing it and using it when we can as well, and to try and learn, if not all of it, bits of it, so we at least understand sort of a little bit about our heritage.
Yeah. It's an amazing point of debate though, and you see it on in blogs and on Twitter and Facebook. People really disagree over it, which took me a bit by surprise. I just assumed that people would quite like the idea of resurrecting a language or something cultural, but there's people see it in a totally different way. They think it's almost going backwards rather than forwards, and is this really where we should be putting focus? So it's quite an interesting one to follow.
Yeah, and what surprised me about it as well was how, I mean, I got how people could be passionate to have it resurrected, well, not resurrected, but to have it more included, to have it on road signs. I was surprised how passionate people were to not have that.
Yeah.
I figured people would be sort of indifferent, like, oh, I don't really see the point of it, but people were really keen to just, no, end of it, which surprised me as well.
It did, it took me, and maybe that's why the Wings piece kind of surprised some people as well, because Wings being Wings, he's very strong in what he says, you know, if he's going to make a point, he'll make the point. And then that got it all going on Twitter and everybody, you know, but it's fascinating to see all those different views coming in and conclusions people are coming to. And then the last piece we've got from the last week of Common Space is something completely different, and this is a column from Joseph Ritchie. This is his first one in Common Space. Forget minimum pricing, why don't we aim to make intoxication a safer hobby? I'm sure a lot of people like this idea. So he's tackling some recent figures that show that alcohol's killing 20 people a week in Scotland, which I think it was alcohol is still killing 20 people a week in Scotland. It seems to be it's that general problem of alcohol and nobody quite knowing what to do to tackle it. And of course the SNP's proposal is minimum pricing, and this is all going through legalities, the courts, and he's as dismayed as everybody else about it. But he's asking whether going down that route is really the way to tackle it. He's thinking, should we take a totally different approach to drugs and alcohol policy? And I'm assuming that's on the basis of people are going to do it anyway. People enjoy using some substances, so do you try and ban it? Do you try and tax it? Or do you try something else? Is there another way of doing it? So he says, we desperately need a policy environment that facilitates innovation around intoxicants, both familiar and unfamiliar, and creates incentives to manufacture safer substances that are both fun and not physically toxic. And of course we need smart, realistic and lean regulatory solutions for the safety testing of these substances, which don't produce either the limited effective oversight of the UK's legal highs market, where the Home Office acts like a remote sniper murdering substances that get their heads above the parapet, or the occasional secrecy and subterfuge documented in pharmaceutical trials by people like Ben Goldacre. He says adopting this approach isn't an overnight solution, nor is it an obvious soundbite. It would take years of dealing with public controversy, experimentation and blazing unknown trails in the policy sphere. However, I believe that if we focus on getting the chemistry right and working to make sure people can get the intoxication they want without the harms, we'll be heading in a better direction. So, interesting points, probably very controversial for some.
It is, but it's very interesting because I remember a few years ago, was it David Nutt was the drugs advisor in Westminster, and he essentially, as drugs advisor, went away and did a lot of research and came back with a properly researched paper documenting how marijuana was essentially less harmful than alcohol, and so he said, well, the logical conclusion here is that we should change the law, and he was fired. It was essentially something that was a controversial opinion. It didn't matter what the science backed up, because there's almost that reactionary element when it comes to the drugs debate, or specifically the war on drugs, that continuously has been shown to fail over and over again because we approach it completely wrong every time. And some other research recently said that if alcohol was discovered now, it'd probably be a class A substance. Like, we wouldn't even have it. It's just traditional that we've had it for so long. It's like, why would you change it now?
It's interesting you mentioned David Nix. I'm sure he's referenced in the article as well. And yet, as we have these debates quite often, it seems clear that the war on drugs doesn't get quite the desired effect, but it doesn't feel like the public's ready yet to really seriously go down that other route. But it's good to be having a debate. You know, we're glad to have that sort of stuff on Common Space.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us, or joining me on this show. We're hoping to start this into a weekly thing where we'll be taking basically what's been discussed over the week and trying to condense it down so anyone can access it. And links to all of the articles we're discussing will be below, so you can read any of them that took your particular interest. And other than that, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.